Nanjing, Nanjing, in the winter of 1937 was a city holding its breath on the brink of catastrophe. As December began, this ancient capital of China, with its massive stone walls built centuries earlier to repel invaders, was filled with dread and uncertainty. War had been raging for months between China and Japan, and the tide was turning against the Chinese. Refugees from outlying villages poured into Nanjing, swelling its population and filling temples and public buildings with homeless families. Food was growing scarce, and each day Japanese warplanes roared overhead, dropping bombs that sent up gouts of flame and smoke. Despite the formidable city walls and artillery emplacements at the gates, few residents truly believed Nanjing could hold out if the Japanese army arrived in force. The memory of Shanghai's fall in November, after a bloody 3-month struggle, was fresh and terrifying. Now the victorious Japanese troops were marching inland, determined to capture China's capital and force a surrender. By early December, Japanese advance units had encircled Nanjing. Distant gunfire rumbled day and night. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, China's leader, had already moved the nationalist government to the interior. Chiang ultimately decided to defend Nanjing to buy time for the rest of China, but he knew the situation was dire. He and his commanders evacuated by air and boat in the days before the final assault, effectively leaving the city's defense to a hastily assembled garrison. Chiang Kai-shek had already evacuated the government officials and foreign diplomats to safer locales. On December 11th, as part of this evacuation, the last American embassy personnel boarded a U.S. Navy gunboat, the USS Panay, to flee via the Yangtze River. Shockingly, on December 12th, Japanese aircraft bombed and sank the Panay even though it was flying American flags, an incident that caused an international furor and for which Japan later apologized. Most other foreign nationals likewise left Nanjing in those final days. Only a small band of about 24 Westerners, missionaries, doctors, professors, and businessmen, remained behind in the doomed capital, determined to do what they could to protect the innocent. They helped establish a neutral Nanjing safety zone in the city center, hoping it might shelter at least some of the civilians from the storm of violence they feared was coming. As the Japanese army closed in, Nanjing's civilian population braced itself. In early December, the thundering of artillery grew louder and more constant. Whole neighborhoods on the outskirts were set ablaze by shell fire. Those civilians who could still escape frantically joined the columns of refugees heading west, clogging the roads out of the city with handcarts, wheelbarrows, and overloaded shoulders carrying what few possessions they could salvage. Within the city, streets emptied as families hunkered down in basements and improvised bomb shelters. Terrified rumors flew from house to house. The Japanese are at the gates. They will take the city in days. In the safety zone downtown, the remaining Westerners worked around the clock to prepare shelters. University buildings, church compounds, warehouses, all were converted into crowded refugee camps. At Jinling Women's College, American missionary Minnie Vautrin directed Chinese volunteers to dig trenches for sanitation and hang Red Cross flags high on the roofs in a vain hope that Japanese bombers might spare the campus. By the second week of December, as Japanese troops fought their way through the last Chinese defensive lines outside Nanjing's walls, an atmosphere of impending doom gripped the city. During the night of December 12, 1937, the night before Nanjing fell, the final collapse of Chinese defenses unleashed pandemonium inside the city. As word spread that the Chinese army commanders had fled, all discipline evaporated in Nanjing's defensive forces. Chinese units unraveled and soldiers abandoned their posts en masse. In desperation, some troops commandeered any vehicles available, military trucks, buses, even horse carts, and raced frantically toward the gates through the darkness. Other soldiers simply cast off their weapons and uniforms and tried to blend into the civilian crowds. Piles of rifles, helmets, and uniforms soon littered the sidewalks. A few Chinese tanks and artillery pieces were left idling in the streets, deserted by their crews. Fires burned unattended where Chinese officers had torched ammunition dumps and fuel stores to deny them to the enemy. Sporadic gunshots rang out as order completely broke down. Frightened civilians cowered in their homes, caught between the vanishing Chinese defense and the approaching invaders. Here and there, a handful of loyal Chinese machine gunners or riflemen kept firing at the distant enemy until they were overrun or ran out of ammunition. But by midnight, the city's resistance had effectively collapsed amid the chaos. At dawn on December 13, 1937, an eerie silence fell over Nanjing. The crackle of gunfire and roar of artillery that had rattled the city for days suddenly stopped. The Chinese flag that had flown above the Great Gate of China on the southern wall had been replaced by the red sun flag of Imperial Japan. Nanjing's walls had been breached and its gates flung open. The Battle of Nanjing was over. Now, columns of Japanese infantry and tanks began to enter the city in force. They encountered almost no organized resistance. Exhausted, demoralized Chinese soldiers, those who hadn't managed to flee, were shedding their uniforms and hiding wherever they could. In the streets, only a few scattered Chinese snipers fired ineffectually from rooftops before being quickly silenced. Otherwise, the conquerors marched in unopposed. Civilians peeking out from behind shuttered windows saw Japanese troops in muddy brown uniforms fanning out across the avenues and boulevards. For a moment, there was a deceptive calm. Many residents dared to hope that perhaps the worst was over, that the city, having surrendered, would be spared major bloodshed. It did not take long for those hopes to be brutally dashed. The Japanese soldiers entering Nanjing were primed for revenge and emboldened by victory. They had just come off 3 months of ferocious combat at Shanghai, where they'd suffered significant casualties. They marched into Nanjing with anger and bloodlust in their hearts, fueled by years of militarist indoctrination that preached the supremacy of Japan and contempt for Chinese inferiors. Many had been told that Nanjing, the enemy capital, would be their final prize, a city to crush as a show of Japan's might. Now that they held Nanjing in their grasp, they saw its populace as conquered subjects who deserved no mercy. Within hours of their entry, the victorious Japanese troops unleashed an orgy of violence that defies belief. Japanese patrols began going door to door, dragging out any man they found. Virtually every Chinese male was assumed to be either a soldier or a potential threat. Hundreds of Chinese men and teenage boys, many of them unarmed young civilians, some as old as 60 or as young as 12, were shoved into improvised holding areas at bayonet point. In some cases, men were summarily shot in front of their families if they were found hiding weapons or wearing parts of a discarded uniform. In others, they were bound with ropes or telephone wire, hands tied behind their backs, and herded through the streets. By the end of that first day, thousands of Chinese prisoners of war and civilian detainees had been assembled under guard at various points around the city, in public parks, open squares, and behind warehouses. The captors showed no interest in distinguishing actual Chinese soldiers from ordinary laborious or students. To them, every Chinese man was an enemy to be killed. John Rabe, the German businessman who led the Nanjing safety zone, ventured out in the afternoon of December 13th to see what was happening. Everywhere he went, he later wrote, he saw corpses. "We come across bodies every 100 to 200 yards, Rabe noted in his diary, and all the civilian men I examine had bullet holes in their backs, as if they were shot fleeing." Unarmed Chinese who ran at the sight of Japanese troops were gunned down from behind. The gutters in some streets literally ran red with blood that day. By the evening of December 13th, the mass executions had begun in earnest. The Japanese Imperial Army had effectively issued an order, direct or tacit, to kill all captives. Some evidence later pointed to Prince Asaka, a member of the imperial family, as having urged this policy. Any Chinese soldier who surrendered, and any man suspected of being an ex-soldier, was marked for death. That night and over the next several days, the invaders carried out one of the most horrific slaughters of modern times. Groups of Chinese prisoners, ranging from a dozen to several thousand at a time, were marched to various isolated locations on the outskirts of Nanjing and systematically massacred. At one large execution site near the Xiaoguan docks on the Yangtze River, on December 14th, several thousand Chinese, a mix of disarmed soldiers and young men rounded up from the city, were lined up on the riverbank. As Japanese machine gun squads positioned their weapons, the bound prisoners began to panic, wailing and pleading. Without hesitation, the Japanese opened fire into the densely packed rows of men. Waves of bodies toppled into the cold winter waters of the Yangtze or crumpled onto the muddy shore. So many were killed that day that the river overflowed its banks with corpses, and the water downstream was tinged pink with blood for days. Japanese soldiers waded through piles of the dead and dying, finishing off survivors with rifle butts and bayonets, then doused the heaps of bodies with gasoline and set them aflame. The sickly sweet stench of burning flesh mixed with the oily smoke that blackened the sky. Another mass execution occurred outside the Taiping Gate, where perhaps 1,200 captured Chinese were machine-gunned in rows. Others were taken to Mufushan, a hill just outside the city, and used for bayonet practice or decapitated with swords. In one grim episode witnessed by a survivor named Tang Jianshan, a group of around 50 Chinese prisoners were being prepared for execution when a Japanese private pulled a pregnant woman out of the lineup. In full view of the condemned, he attempted to rape her. The woman resisted frantically. Enraged, the soldier stabbed her swollen belly with his bayonet, killing her and her unborn child in a spasm of cruelty before he rejoined the firing squad and the executions proceeded. Such was the fate of many, the slaughter often accompanied by grotesque acts of sadism. Witnesses later described entire pits filled with headless corpses, indicating how routine beheadings had become. Others saw bodies that had been mutilated or even nailed to walls. The massacre was not merely military, it was deeply personal, intimate brutality committed face to face, bayonet to gut, sword to neck. Perhaps the most notorious atrocity of those initial days was a killing contest publicized in Japanese newspapers. Two junior officers, Second Lieutenants Toshioki Mukai and Tsuyo Shinoda of the Japanese 16th Division, had allegedly challenged each other to see who could kill 100 Chinese people first with their swords. This gruesome game had actually begun during the march to Nanking and was gleefully reported in Japan's press as if it were a sporting event. By the time the two officers reached Nanking's outskirts, both claimed to have far exceeded 100 kills, though neither could definitively say who had won the contest. One article jokingly suggested they start a new race to 150. This story, while treated lightly in Japan at the time, later became emblematic of the unbelievable cruelty unleashed at Nanking. Many Japanese soldiers took part in similar barbaric games on the city's captive population, competing in bayoneting contests, burning people alive, or seeing how many bodies they could hack apart in a day. Such actions were not the result of a momentary breakdown in discipline. They were the product of a military culture that had completely dehumanized the enemy. Japanese troops in Nanking had been taught to regard Chinese lives as worthless. One private later recalled how his unit was encouraged to practice bayonet techniques on live Chinese prisoners lined up in rows. He admitted that at the time he felt nothing, having been trained to feel nothing. Some Japanese later confessed that in those weeks they became numb to killing. One soldier remembered slicing apart helpless Chinese tied together on the riverbank without any emotion, while another admitted he came to view all Chinese as subhuman. Only many years later did a few of these perpetrators, such as former soldier Shiro Izuma, publicly acknowledge their guilt and express remorse for what was done in Nanking, once the moral reality of their actions finally set in. As Japanese troops secured their hold on Nanking in the days after December 13th, the carnage only escalated. The city was delivered over to an orgy of looting, arson, and rape. The triumphant soldiers, many of them hungry and cold after their long campaign, now acted as though Nanking was theirs by right of conquest. Everything and everyone in it was a spoil of war. Soldiers broke into shops, homes, and warehouses across the city, stealing anything of value. They tore silks and furs off mannequins in department stores, pocketed gold jewelry and jade ornaments, smashed open bank vaults and safes, and hauled away sacks of rice and flour from food warehouses. They invaded foreign-owned businesses too, despite painted signs declaring them property of neutral nations. One German baker's cafe was ransacked. John Rabe wrote of seeing Japanese troops happily stuffing their packs with loaves of bread and cakes before setting the place on fire. Hempel's Hotel, a well-known establishment, was similarly looted and wrecked. Almost every storefront on Changshan Road and Taiping Road, the main commercial streets, was vandalized or burnt. The city's fire brigades had long since fled, so the blazes set by the looters raged unchecked. At least a third of Nanking's buildings were ultimately destroyed by fire in those weeks. By day, columns of greasy smoke rose from different quarters of the city. By night, the horizon glowed orange, and the sounds of crackling flames and collapsing timbers echoed in the darkness. Most nightmarish of all was the violence against Nanking's women. As the phrase rape of Nanking suggests, the Japanese occupiers subjected tens of thousands of females, from young girls to old grandmothers, to sexual brutality on a shocking scale. Hardly had the city fallen when Japanese soldiers began searching door to door for women. Any female found was potential prey. Teenage girls and college students were particular targets, but no category was truly safe. Married women, widows, pregnant mothers, and even nuns were assaulted. Fathers and husbands tried desperately to hide their wives and daughters. Some dressed young women in boys' clothes or smeared them with soot to make them appear less attractive. Some built false walls or secret compartments in their homes. Others begged the foreigners in the safety zone to take their girls into the protected camps. But the Japanese soldiers were relentless and often pitiless. They pried open locked closets and cellar doors with bayonets. They seized women who were huddling in fear or attempting to disguise themselves. In broad daylight, soldiers dragged women out onto the streets and raped them on the spot, sometimes in front of their own families. At night, the soldiers hunted in packs. "You hear nothing but rape," John Rabe wrote on December 17th. If husbands or brothers intervene, they shot. What you hear and see on all sides is the brutality and bestiality of the Japanese soldiers. On that single night, by Rabe's estimation, at least 1,000 women and girls were raped throughout the city, including around 100 girls at Jinling College, which was supposedly a protected refugee shelter. No place was truly safe. Japanese troops climbed over compound walls and broke into refugee camps that had been declared off-limits, just to snatch more victims. The rapes were often gang rapes, carried out with astonishing cruelty. Victims who resisted were beaten with rifle butts, cut with knives, or shot. Many women, likely the majority of those assaulted, were killed immediately after the rape, either out of convenience or sadism. It became routine. Soldiers would force entry into a home, rape the women inside, sometimes repeatedly and by multiple men, and then bayonet or shoot them before moving on. Some soldiers grew bored with ordinary rape and devised gruesome tortures. 2 Japanese soldiers raped a 16-year-old girl until she could not move, then rammed a bamboo pole into her vagina, causing internal injuries that killed her. Another victim, a woman about to give birth, was raped and then stabbed through her pregnant belly. The soldiers actually cut out the fetus for sport. Pregnant women in particular seemed to enrage some of the attackers, who took pride in bayoneting the swollen stomachs and mutilating both mother and unborn child. There were cases of mothers raped in front of their children, and of daughters raped in front of their parents. Occasionally, the soldiers engaged in the perversity of forcing family members to commit incest at gunpoint, sons ordered to rape their mothers, or fathers forced to rape daughters, while the troops watched and laughed, before ending everyone's lives with bullets or bayonets. Such diabolical scenes sound utterly unbelievable, and yet they were recorded in multiple survivor testimonies and foreign witness reports. Reverend John McGee, an American missionary, wrote in a letter that he could write pages of the horrors he had seen, things one could not imagine in the modern world. He likened Nanking under Japanese occupation to a descent into ancient barbarism. Indeed, Nanking in those weeks became a literal hell on earth. Corpses littered the streets, many left where they fell for days. The smell of death lay over the city, a heavy, sweet, sickening odor that seeped into everything. Stray dogs roamed freely, feasting on human remains. Packs of rats swarmed over the piles of bodies in alleys and gutters. In some neighborhoods, the bodies of entire families lay in their doorways, flies buzzing in thick clouds around them. Smoke from the many fires mingled with the stench of decay to form a choking pall that hung above Nanking. The bodies are everywhere, hundreds of them, Dr. Robert Wilson wrote on December 15th. We see the traces of slaughter in every street. He and the other surgeons at the university hospital worked feverishly amid these conditions, attempting to save whoever they could. They performed surgery by candlelight on women with horrific internal injuries from rape, and on men with ghastly bayonet or gunshot wounds. The hospital itself was not spared the intrusion of Japanese soldiers. Twice in the first week, troops barged in and dragged bleeding patients, men, off the operating tables to execute them outside. In the safety zone refugee camps, survivors huddled together and whispered about what they had seen. An almost tangible terror hung in the air. One refugee later said that people in Nanking became like hunted animals those days, flinching at every distant shout or gunshot. For weeks, the massacres, rapes, and fires continued, turning the once beautiful capital into a city of the dead. Amid this horror, the Nanking safety zone stood out as a flicker of humanity. Inside the zone, a few square miles in the heart of the city, the remaining Westerners and a small number of Chinese helpers struggled to provide a measure of refuge. At its peak, the safety zone harbored some 200,000 Chinese civilians. They were crammed into every available space, families sleeping shoulder to shoulder in church pews and under tarpaulins in schoolyards, elderly refugees huddling in hallways and storage sheds. Sanitation and food were woefully inadequate, but for many, merely being inside the zone offered a faint hope of survival. The Japanese authorities had initially agreed, before taking the city, that the safety zone would not be molested. In practice, however, Japanese troops frequently violated its boundaries. They would appear at the edges of the refugee camps, sometimes in broad daylight, demanding to inspect for Chinese soldiers, which usually meant they would grab any young men they found. The Safety Zone Committee, a group of about a dozen Westerners led by John Rabe, would protest vigorously whenever the Japanese tried to remove people, but often could only watch helplessly as supposed suspects were taken away to likely execution. During the nights, drunken Japanese soldiers frequently slipped over the zone's bamboo fences or walls to kidnap women. The zone volunteers set up patrols and posted signs pleading in Japanese for soldiers to stay out, but these measures were only partly effective. Many terrible things still occurred even inside the safety zone's perimeter. However, there is no doubt that without the zone, the massacre's victims would have been even more numerous. The foreigners' presence and the shelters they organized saved thousands of lives, perhaps tens of thousands. Chinese men who might have been executed on sight elsewhere survived in the zone, though a number were still seized. Countless women found at least some protection behind the gates of places like Jinling College, where Minnie Vautrin and her Chinese staff courageously stood at the entrances to turn away prowling Japanese soldiers. Vautrin often literally put herself between Japanese troops and the girls in her care, begging the intruders to leave or flatly lying that there were no young women present. She and others like John Rabe also kept exhaustive records of the atrocities, writing down each rape or murder case reported to them in hopes that someday justice might be done. These records would later become crucial evidence. The International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone, the formal name of the foreigners' group, lodged daily protests with the Japanese embassy. They typed up letters itemizing each day's horrors. So many rapes, so many killings, naming locations, and sometimes victims if known. Day after day, throughout the latter half of December 1937 and into January 1938, the Westerners pressed these letters into the hands of Japanese diplomats or officers and demanded that the rampage be stopped. At first, they received only denials or vague promises. It was only in January, after weeks of slaughter, that the Japanese High Command began to feel international pressure and the realization dawned that they needed to rein in their troops. By that point, much of Nanjing lay in ruins and perhaps a quarter of its population was dead. A gradual change in the occupying army's behavior took place as the new year of 1938 arrived. General Iwan Matsui, the overall Japanese commander, who had fallen ill during the height of the massacre, finally entered the city in mid-December and was reportedly appalled by what his troops had done. He admonished some officers and ordered a semblance of discipline restored. Matsui even held a Shinto memorial service for the war dead and paid a visit to the tomb of Sun Yat-sen, the revered founder of modern China, on the outskirts of Nanjing as an act of respect, though this gesture rang hollow amid the devastation. More concretely, the Japanese army began bringing in military police units to Nanjing to reimpose discipline among the rank and file. Japanese commanders also realized that the uncontrolled massacre was undermining their own goals. The piles of rotting corpses were leading to disease and pestilence, and disturbing reports of the carnage were beginning to leak to the outside world. They needed Nanjing pacified and functional. In early January 1938, the army installed a puppet Chinese municipal government, attempting to show that life was returning to normal under their rule. They also announced that the safety zone would be dissolved by the end of that month, insisting that the refugees leave the camps and return to what remained of their homes. As January wore on, the large-scale killings tapered off, partly because there were hardly any young men left alive to kill, and partly due to stricter orders from above. The frequency of rape also decreased from its horrific peak, though isolated acts of brutality by Japanese soldiers still occurred daily. The occupiers now turned to the grim work of disposing of bodies and clearing the wreckage of the city, if only to stave off epidemics. When the dust finally settled by early February 1938, Nanjing was a haunted, shattered city. A once vibrant metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people had been reduced to a barely living ghost town. In some neighborhoods, one could walk block after block and encounter nothing but ruined buildings and decomposing corpses. The Red Swastika Society, a Chinese charitable organization, eventually collected and interred over 42,000 bodies in mass burials, and this was only a portion of the dead. Countless more had been incinerated in the mass burnings, thrown into the Yangtze River, or buried in makeshift graves by surviving relatives. The population that had found refuge in the safety zone, roughly a couple 100,000, were virtually all that was left of Nanjing's citizenry. It was said that after the massacre, Nanjing became a city of widows, and indeed, one striking absence was evident in the streets. Hardly any young Chinese men were to be seen. The invaders had killed nearly every male of military age that they could catch. The demographic fabric of the city had been forever changed. A great many children had lost one or both parents. Women in untold numbers had suffered sexual violence. In addition to the physical injuries and pregnancies that resulted, they bore deep emotional scars. Disease also took a toll in the aftermath. Injuries and the diseases that inevitably spread in the massacre's wake, cholera, dysentery, and other illnesses born of the polluted water and decaying bodies, continued to claim lives even after the shooting stopped. Dr. Robert Wilson and his hospital staff, exhausted and heartbroken, kept treating the lingering survivors, trying to mend bodies that were broken in more ways than one. For the tens of thousands of Nanjing residents who survived the massacre, the the psychological trauma was profound. In the months that followed, many struggled simply to continue living amid the horror they had experienced. Parents who had seen their children murdered woke screaming from nightmares. Children who had lost their entire families wandered the ruins in a numb daze or clung to any kindly stranger in the refugee camps. Every neighborhood seemed to have vacant, burnt-out homes that stood as painful reminders of those who were gone. At night, the city remained eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional sob of a widow or the muffled cries of someone reliving their trauma in dreams. The people of Nanking carried on as best they could, but an inescapable pall of grief lay over the devastated city. Even as the massacre was happening, news of the atrocities began to trickle out. The world at large learned of the Nanking massacre only gradually. At first, global attention was scant. Other crises loomed in Europe and elsewhere, and the horrors in faraway Nanking did not immediately galvanize international intervention. Japan's authorities did their utmost to censor and downplay news of what its army had done. Many outside observers could not quite believe the earliest fragmentary reports, which sounded too extreme to be credible. Yet bits of evidence did emerge. A handful of Westerners who had witnessed the carnage, journalists, missionaries, and diplomats, managed to get word out. One New York Times correspondent, Frank Tillman Durden, escaped Nanking and published a chilling account on December 18, 1937, under the headline "Butchery Marks Japanese Entry into Nanking," detailing indiscriminate killings and chaos. Other neutral witnesses provided similar reports. These accounts, along with photographs and even a reel of 16mm film footage that Reverend John McGee managed to smuggle out, gave the world a first glimpse of the truth. Meanwhile, the rape of Nanking, as it was soon called, became a synonym for wartime atrocity. The shocking stories from the safety zone and the testimonies of refugees stiffened Chinese resolve to resist and appalled people around the globe. Even before the full story was known, news from Nanking further poisoned Japan's international reputation and deepened the outrage in Western nations over Japan's conduct in China. Still, it was not until after World War II, when the full scope of Japanese war crimes was exposed, that the reality of Nanking's nightmare was confirmed beyond any doubt. At the war's end, the wheels of justice turned, albeit slowly, for some of the perpetrators of the Nanking massacre. In 1946, during the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in Tokyo, the atrocities at Nanking were given significant attention. General Matsui Iwan, who had overall command of the invading forces, and Lieutenant General Tani Hisaro, who had personally directed mass execution operations, were found guilty of war crimes for their roles in Nanking. Both men were executed by hanging in 1948. Two junior officers, Toshioki Mukai and Tsuyo Shinoda, the same men who had notoriously competed in a Kill 100 sword contest, were also arrested and tried by a Chinese military tribunal in Nanking. They too were found guilty and were executed in 1947 for their wanton slaughter. However, countless soldiers and junior officers who took part in the rampage were never brought to trial. The limited justice delivered could not undo what had happened in Nanking, but at least it formally acknowledged the enormity of the crimes. In the years and decades after the massacre, Nanking, now romanized as Nanjing, struggled to rebuild itself and to honor the memory of those who perished. Today, a large concrete memorial stands in the city, near a site known as the Pit of 10,000 Corpses, a mass grave where thousands of victims' remains were unearthed. Every December, sirens sound in Nanjing to commemorate the weeks of horror that the city endured. The massacre left an indelible scar on China's national memory and remains a source of deep sorrow and anger. It also fundamentally changed international perceptions of Japan at the time, shocking the world's conscience with its scale of cruelty. In China, the officially stated death toll of the massacre is 300,000, a number etched in stone at the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall. Most historians continue to estimate that hundreds of thousands of people were killed during those weeks of carnage. Even if the precise figure will never be known, the magnitude of the slaughter in Nanjing is incontestable. The rape of Nanjing remains one of the most appalling episodes of wartime barbarity, a somber testament to the depths of human cruelty and a tragedy the world must never forget.